Now, to this, Israel continues its bombardment of Rafah, south of Gaza today, as black smoke billowed over the border of Gaza. This comes a day after the International Court of Justice ordered the state of Israel to halt its attack in Rafah. It marked the landmark emergency ruling, on a case brought by South Africa accusing Israel of genocide in its assault on the Gaza Strip. Israeli ministers dismissed the ruling and vowed to continue fighting to free its hostages and defeat Hamas. The court also ordered Israel to maintain open border crossing and access into Rafah for unhinged provision at scale of urgently needed humanitarian assistance. Meanwhile, outside Israel, there has been shock at the harrowing images of the suffering in the ruins of Gaza, where aid agencies struggling to get enough emergency supplies in growing reports of humanitarian crises. We're now joined by Thembisa Fakude, senior researcher and fellow and director at the Africa-Asia Dialogue. Thembisa, good afternoon. Really do appreciate you joining us this evening. Is this a sign once again that international law is ineffective at being able to change and influence the behavior of nation states, particularly ones at war such as Israel at the moment, given that a day after a very stern ruling by the International Court of Justice, it continues its attacks that it was called not to do?
Well, it certainly is a situation, especially when it comes to Israel. Israel continues to do as it pleases, notwithstanding that we've got now two judgments against this country, but it continues to do as it pleases. In fact, before the verdict was out, they've already pronounced that nothing is going to stop them. There's no authority on earth that will stop them from continuing doing what they're doing at the moment in Rafah. So certainly when it comes to Israel, it's a problem. But it also compromises multilateralism, something that all of us depend on, particularly developing nations. The only way developing nations can be competitive and be heard internationally is through multilateral platforms. So if you're going to compromise multilateral platforms, particularly platforms such as ICJ and ICC, you're compromising the chances of smaller nations and developing nations of being heard in the future.
Yeah, perhaps to then ask us what is to be done, especially by the United Nations Security Council following this particular judgment and noting the continued attack by Israel, on Rafah by Israel.
Well, I don't think there's anything much that's going to be done. As long as we have big nations, members of the P5, which is the United States, supporting Israel, and United States senior leadership telling the ICC and ICJ to go to hell, quote unquote, you have a serious problem. So there's really little that the world can do, except, of course, if the pressure can come from other bigger developed nations, particularly Europeans, to put pressure on the United States and Israel to adhere to the ruling of the ICJ.
But can American pressure influence the behavior of Benjamin Netanyahu at the moment? We've seen, for instance, very specifically also Joe Biden calling on Israel to not go ahead with its planned attack in Rafah, and yet it did nonetheless. It seems like Israel is saying to America as well, go to hell. But America can't seem to influence their behavior. So how pivotal then is America's involvement in influencing the behavior, especially getting Israel to comply with the judgment?
Well, I think at the moment, because of the elections that are forthcoming in the United States, stakes are high, and I think Joe Biden's hands are a bit tight because he depends on certain support from his constituents in the United States. So whatever it does now that will hurt Israel is certainly not going to be accepted to his constituency. And I think politics at the moment are taking a leading role to common sense. And unfortunately, this has to happen at this time of the American political history, and as a result, the Americans, I think, will kick the can down the road just to ensure that they get that necessary support for Joe Biden to win. And I don't see any other way out of this, except that at the moment you're going to have support, whatever it takes, for Israel.
Yeah, non-compliance with judgments of the UN court can be grounds to talking about sanctioning a specific country, particularly a member state. The expulsion of a member state is not a conversation that the UN body often entertains or gives much credence to, but surely that conversation does now have to come onto the table.
No, certainly it has to come to the table, but there's so much little respect at the moment for multilateral platforms. And I think the ICJ and the ICC is very concerned of being compromised in terms of its credibility. Because if Israel does not really adhere to the rulings that have since been taking place, in fact, more are still coming, of course, from the ICC perspective, you are likely, therefore, to compromise this very important body. And as it was correctly said, that it's seen as a body that was created mainly for Africans and some of the despots in the former European territories, including Russia. So now that for the first time you've got an ally of a Western nation facing these charges, you see these ganging up of certain countries, particularly Britain and the United States, compromising the credibility of the ICJ. So it's really difficult times for multilateral bodies, including the ICJ at the moment, and hopefully the United States will find some sense as this saga continues to take a principled position that will protect this multilateralism that all of us appreciate.
In the 2008 financial crisis, we asked the questions of the banks that were being bailed out by the US Fed. Are they too big to fail? We now ask that question about nation states and ask the question, is Israel too big to be held accountable?
Well, for now, at least, Israel is too big to be held accountable. I mean, if you think about the number of countries that have pronounced very clearly about and warned Israel not to go into Rafah, and Israel did so, we are seeing the unraveling and genocide in real time on a daily basis on our screen. And you still have countries that really do support Israel and feel that Israel's got the right to defend itself. Now you've got ICJ and ICC pronouncing against Israel. You've got these countries coming gun raising, saying that nothing should happen to Israel and Israel is on the right course. So we are in a very, very interesting times and uncharted territory.
Yeah.
And I don't see any sense of reason coming out from the United States at the moment or any of the developed nations, particularly the P5 nations.
Yep. One simply has to ask, are we facing the death of multilateralism as we know it? We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. That was Senior Research Fellow and Director at the Africa-Asia Dialogue, Thembisa Fakude.